welcome. If you could share your name, title, and organization, please.
Yeah, so my name is Connor. I'm a software engineer and sort of a content creator. And I work most closely with a company called Algo Expert. And then I also do a lot of sort of freelancing contract work on my own.
Okay, could you, I say briefly describe what led you to your current role, but I know some of your backstory. And so I'm really interested in you sharing with us maybe a little bit of your history that led you here and where you've been in your career.
Yeah, sure. So I went to the University of Washington. I majored in informatics there, and which is sort of similar to computer science. So a lot of coding, a lot of like web design and things like that as well. And I really enjoyed that. And then I was also a teaching assistant while I was there. So I helped teach a web development class. And I really enjoyed the sort of teaching aspect of that. And then after I graduated from college, I worked at Facebook, or now Meta, for a little bit over a year. So I was a software engineer there. I enjoyed that a lot, got to build some cool products. And then I did sort of miss the sort of teaching aspect that I liked a lot when I was a teaching assistant. So I joined this company called Algo Expert, which is basically an education company in the tech space. So I got to do sort of a mixture of the software engineering side and the teaching side, which is cool. And then I was also always sort of interested in like YouTube and content creation and all that. So after I left Facebook, I also started my own like YouTube channel and all that.
Very outside of my own personal expertise. So you're a software engineer, teacher / content creator, maybe put you under that umbrella. Yeah. What education, training, experience do you need to be where you are in your career currently? And maybe even if you could share entry level for your career as well.
Yeah. So in my case, like I said, I have a bachelor's degree in informatics, and usually a 4-year degree is the most straightforward path to software engineering. The vast majority of people I've worked with have a 4-year degree, most of them in computer science. But there's a bunch of other options like informatics, like I have, or there's software engineering degrees, or a lot of people have like math degrees, things like that. But then there's also other avenues too. So you don't actually need the degree. It's not like to go be a doctor, you need a medical degree. There's no way around it. With software engineering, there are a lot of other paths. So it's sort of like if you have the skill set and you can prove that to an employer, then you can do this job. So a lot of people go to these coding boot camps, which are sort of like 6-month to 12-month, almost vocational schools. So they're these like intensive training programs specific to software engineering. Other people self-teach on their own online. I usually don't recommend that unless it's just like the only option, just because it's much harder to sort of get your foot in the door that way. But yeah, there's a lot of different avenues to sort of the entry-level jobs.
Okay. Could you, for people, let's really make it basic. For anyone in high school or middle school even, who doesn't have any understanding of software development, how would you explain it?
That's a good question. So essentially our job is to build software, as it sounds. So whether it be websites or apps or other software systems. So a lot of times we think about how basically every company now, tech company or not, has a mobile app. They all have websites, they have all these things. But there's also a lot of other software development that happens. So there's software happening in logistics companies to keep track of all of their inventory and how it's being routed across the country. So there's a lot of software happening sort of on the back end of a lot of companies, but then there's also a lot of it happening that's more like consumer focused. So for example, when I worked at Facebook, like most of us were working on features of the Facebook website or Instagram or things like that. And sort of the day-to-day is essentially figuring out what exactly we want to be building. So a lot of it is sort of figuring out what features we want to build, what exactly the user needs are. And then obviously the majority of the time is actually spent on building out those features. So a lot of like computer coding.
So what would you say are the most critical skills, hard and soft skills, for someone who's had a career like yours?
So I'd say I mean, by far the most critical skill is learning how to code. That being like the core hard skill that is essentially a requirement, whether you learn it through a computer science degree or online or wherever it might be. And then I'd say after that, communication is probably like the biggest skill, at least to do well in the field. Like the only, I think, like hard requirement to get the entry level job is knowing how to code. But communication skills are probably the most important as far as like actually advancing your career and doing well in the field. Uh, One way to put it is like you can build all the software you want, but if you can't explain to people why that software is important and explain to people why they should be using that software, why we need it, then it doesn't really matter how good you were at building it. So a lot of it is sort of communication and being able to like describe both your thought process in terms of like what we're building, why we're building it, as well as your thought process from like an engineering perspective. So a lot of it's collaborative, working with other engineers, as well as working with designers and managers, et cetera, and trying to describe to them why you want to do this and the way you want to do it, whether it be for user need reasons or whether it be for like engineering restriction reasons, and being able to like describe those things is super important.
I think communication is probably a critical soft skill in most positions out in the world right now. But I think that's interesting. Some of the specific areas you shared, I maybe wouldn't have thought of. Can you tell us what an average day looks like for you right now? And then, because I'm curious, I'd love to hear what an average day looks like when you worked at Facebook.
Yeah, so I'll start with the Facebook one because that one's a little bit more straightforward. So at Facebook, so one thing that's nice about this industry is most companies are pretty flexible as far as like when exactly you're working and whatnot, as long as you're just getting the work done. So I was never like a morning person. So I usually started work around 10 or so. And I would say anywhere from a quarter of the day to maybe half of the day was spent in meetings. So that'd be a mixture of like maybe a one-on-one with my manager, maybe a one-on-one with an intern or somebody that I'm helping mentor. Maybe there's a few team-wide meetings where we're sort of discussing the direction of the whole team. Maybe there's a few like project-specific meetings with a few different stakeholders or whatnot to discuss like projects we're working on. And then the rest of the day would be mostly time spent implementing those features. So most of that time is sort of solo time at the computer writing code. Some of that can be a little bit more collaborative. So sometimes we might work together on certain features, or a lot of times we'll be working with other people where somebody will have some roadblock they come to, and usually it sort of works out that like different people on the team become experts in different areas. So it becomes sort of collaborative of like, hey, I don't really know how to do this thing. Can you help me with this? And then a lot of that's happening. But for the most part, like the other half of the days or so is usually spent like coding. But obviously that can vary a lot as to like how many meetings you have, how much actual like work time you have. And then now I would say my days are very varied. So usually the first thing I do in the morning is go through any new bug reports I might have gotten to see if there's any like users I need to follow up with. And then I usually go through all my comments on all my social media in the morning too, just to see if there's anything that like warrants me responding, and then also if there's anything I need to remove or anything like that. So I go through all the comments in the morning, and then after that, if there was some bug or something I need to deal with, I go deal with that. Sort of the next thing on my agenda usually is to go through email, which is not a big part of the job when I was at Facebook, but now sort of doing the more independent stuff. I have a lot of companies I work with that do sponsorships and things like that. So I have to go through all of that to make sure I'm following up with everybody. A lot of the companies I work with are international. So I'm on the West Coast of the US. A lot of them are in Europe. So a lot of them will email me overnight, essentially for me. So then I'll respond in the morning. And then after that, it's sort of depends on like what exactly I'm working on that day. So some days, the rest of the day will be coding out something, or other days it'll be recording a video or editing a video, something like that. So what I do the rest of the day sort of depends a lot on like the individual day.
Wow. Okay. It sounds like you would need, or I would need, a lot of self-discipline to have that that day. This is an off-topic question off my script here, but how do you keep yourself organized in a role like that, where with that type of expectation on yourself?
Probably not well enough, but I use a software called Notion. I don't know if you've used it before. It's sort of like Google Docs, but like way beefier. So I use that to sort of keep track of everything I'm doing. So I just sort of I have like basically a chart of like, these are the things that I need to make sure I do every day. These are the things I need to make sure I do like today. Like usually I'll just do that at the end of the day or at night, or at some point I'll make a list of like, this is basically the to-do list of the day. And then I have more like long-term, like these are things I need to do eventually. And I sort of use that to keep track of stuff, but it's probably not the best system.
No, I mean, if it works, it works. And so it's a beefed out to-do list essentially, right?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. What would you say is the best part of your job?
Um, I would say the freedom is probably the best part of the job. So even at Facebook, but even more so now, just like the freedom of the flexible work where if I want to work later in the day and sleep in, I can. If I want to take time off to go be with family over the holidays or to go take a vacation or something, it's usually very flexible, even at like the big tech companies to do that. So I'd say that like level of freedom it provides is super nice. And then as far as like the actual work itself, it's really cool seeing lots of people using your stuff you're building and enjoying it. So like with the work we do now, like seeing reviews of it online, seeing people post on LinkedIn that in our case, we make like this education platform. So seeing people post on LinkedIn that they used it and they just landed a new job is always super cool too.
Yeah, I've seen quite a bit of that on my LinkedIn feed where people tag you in things, and I think that's really special to get to be a part of someone's career journey
Yeah.
themselves, and you've helped prepare them for that. So very cool work that you get to do. Um, so that's the good stuff. What would you say is the most challenging part of your job?
Um, I think in tech in general, there can be like high stress sometimes around releases. Um, so it's sort of this like fairly relaxed career most of the time, and then there'll be these sort of like sprints of like we need to get this thing out, and it varies a lot as far as like the specific aspect of tech you work in. For example, like the game industry, like the majority of their games like have to come out like usually right before Christmas, and it's like from what I've heard, like can be very intense at certain like game companies to like get games out like in that sort of last sprint. But even at like the more traditional tech companies, like you all features that you need out, whether it be just sort of arbitrary dates that you all might have picked as a team, but they've sort of become these dates you need to get things done by, or sometimes even dates that have been promised to like much higher ups at the company, um, or just in the case now of like the things we do, dates that make sense for us as far as like wanting to get things out maybe before Black Friday or something like that. So that can be, I think, stressful. That's probably the worst part, but it's not too bad. It's not something that happens too often. And also, if you are good with time management and being realistic with like setting expectations early on, that shouldn't happen. But realistically, it still does.
Yeah, those deadlines will get you for sure.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to know what your long-term career goals are. I know, if you don't mind sharing, your age, I think it'd be really interesting for the students that are watching to see how young you are and what you've accomplished. But where are you headed? Where do you want to be in 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah. So I'm 25, turned 26 in like 10 days. Um, where do I want to be in 5 to 10 years? Honestly, I don't know. Um, maybe that's a good thing to hear for people. Like a lot of people don't know where they want to be in 5 years, maybe even like 1 year, honestly. Um, I think long term, like my goals now are to build up the social media a lot and sort of see what doors and avenues that opens up. At some point, I'd like to do sort of my own startup. So I've sort of gotten a taste of like the more entrepreneurship side over the last like couple years with doing a lot of more independent work and doing the social media and all of that. But I think it would be fun to formally start like an actual startup at some point. That's probably in the 5 year or so horizon.
Okay, super interesting. Um, what advice would you give students or anyone maybe looking to change career paths in finding a career that they really enjoy?
I think the biggest thing is just like trying lots of different stuff. Certain careers can sound fun just because like you might have some picture in your mind of what people in that career actually do, and it might not actually be accurate. And other things that sound super boring might actually be super interesting to you. Um, so like in software engineering specifically, I think a lot of people see it as it sounds very boring. And like some people don't enjoy it, and that's fine. But I know a lot of people who just happened to take like an intro computer science class while they were in college because they had some requirement to get an extra class in for whatever reason, and realized they actually loved that class and ended up switching their major to it. So I'd say just like experimenting with lots of different things, and giving things a shot, even if they don't sound interesting at the surface to you.
I think that's really great advice. The last few interviews I've done, that's been the resounding noise that I'm hearing. Everybody kind of agrees. You don't know what you don't know, and that's why we're doing this series to expose students and anyone who's interested into more than they've seen what's right in front of their face, or what their parents do, or what their parents or their friends' parents do. Give them an opportunity to know what the day-to-day really does look like, and maybe surprise themselves on what they might be interested in. So I've got another question here for you. What advice would you give to students to prepare for an interview? I think this is perfect for what you're currently doing.
Yeah. So I think the first sort of step for me is always like figure out what exactly that interview is going to entail. So like specifically in tech, we have a lot of different types of interviews. So we have sort of the behavioral interview where it's going to be them asking you questions about your experiences and why you want to work there, things like that. And figuring out like sort of a list of what are the possible questions they could be asking me, and having not necessarily like prepared responses. Like you don't want to be like a robot just like giving off some response, but like having ideas of stories that are good stories to come back to answer different questions, things like that. And then for the more technical side of interviews, just like practicing doing those things. Like that's what we primarily focus on, is helping people with technical interviews. I think the big thing with that is like just getting the reps and getting a lot of practice and practicing like the interview. Like I think a lot of people have a tendency, both the technical and non-technical and other careers and whatnot, to sort of practice for interviews in their head, in the sense of like they'll read through a list of questions and sort of go through it in their head and make sure that they have an answer in mind. But I think it's really helpful to actually verbally answer the questions, because that's how you're going to do it in an interview. You're not going to be just thinking of your answers. You're going to have to articulate them to somebody else. So practicing doing that, even if there's not anybody listening. And if you can get somebody to listen, doing like mock interviews too can be helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's one of the hardest parts of going into something and being so excited for a job, and then getting to the interview and not really having prepared yourself, thinking that you were prepared, but not having really said those things out loud ever before. So you stumble quite a bit, or at least that's what I did in my early career. So I think it's great advice to practice, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if you feel like it's overkill. It's probably not.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question would be, what is the job outlook for your occupation? So let's say software engineering as a field.
I mean, we're sort of at an awkward point right now where there's this massive boom of tech during the pandemic, and I'm sure you've seen in the news, a lot of the big tech companies have done layoffs. So it is sort of an awkward point right now, but I think in the long term, we have like some of the best job prospects of any field. Like if you just think about like different aspects of your life and try to find any of them where tech isn't a part of that, it's almost impossible. Like if you think about literally every single company, or every like medium-sized company and larger, probably has some tech, whether it be websites and apps or other like backend infrastructure they need. So I think it's something that's going to continue to grow. I think it's evolving a lot with AI and things like that, but I think it's going to continue to grow and continue to be like one of the biggest fields. Of course, I can't predict the future, but
Okay. And do you have anything to add if we touched on content creation and kind of where you're headed with that? What do you think is the outlook for that?
Yeah, that one's fun because people have been saying for the last like 10 years that it's too late to start. Like I remember hearing people talk about that in like 2012 when YouTube was first becoming like this thing where it's like, oh wait, people are making a living doing this. And I remember hearing it like years later and still hearing it today. And it hasn't happened. Like people are blowing up with content every single day. It's if anything, it's easier now than it's been before because of TikTok. It's just much easier to grow an audience on than anything else has ever been. So I think it's a field that's going to continue to grow. It's also one that I think will continue to get more and more saturated though. Like so many kids, like when you ask what they want to do when they're older, it's they want to be a streamer or a YouTuber or whatever. And that'll probably continue, which does add some saturation to it. So it's definitely not like a guaranteed career field. Like if you go get a degree in computer science, like you're fairly guaranteed to have a career out of that versus like there's no guarantees in content creation. But I think anybody can do it, which is cool.
I think the way you've done it is very interesting, though, because you are a subject matter expert now, which sets you aside from the majority of people who are creating these accounts and maybe watching your platforms grow has been cool, because I know that the people who are following you aren't following because they saw some viral video. They're following because they really genuinely want your advice or they want to know what you know. And so I think that that's a really smart way to do it, because you have something that they want. You know something that they want to know as well, and they value your opinion. I think they're going to stay with you and grow with you as well. So
yeah, I think with how like it has become a more saturated area, like finding something that you can do that other people can't do is usually the sweet spot now of like how you can grow. Like it used to be in 2010 or whatever, if you wanted to make a career as a content creator, you just had to be one of the biggest creators on the platform, which meant you had to have the most views possible. You had to appeal to the widest audiences possible. But now, since things have matured so much, you can just be like a voice in a very specific niche. And that is enough to sort of build a legitimate career around. And I think it's much easier that way than like trying to be the next Mr. Beast or whatever, because like not to discourage people, but like that's just far less realistic.
yeah, I think being realistic is important, and these are real careers that many people don't understand, and so I think you're shedding some really important light on them. But being realistic is important, and understanding what you're trying to accomplish with the advice that you've given, I think, is super cool. All right, last question from me would be, are there any opportunities with you or within your organization for internships, job shadowing, mentorship? And then also, what advice would you give someone who's trying to, get these things, internship, mentorship, those things in your career field?
Yeah. So we're very small, so we don't have like programs for that at the moment. But as far as like in general, I think the things that I usually tell people are, it sort of comes down to like three things. Like one, first, just like building the skills to be able to provide some value to whoever's going to be helping you. Like obviously as like an intern and being mentored, like you're there to learn, but also you're there to provide some amount of value. And then working on your resume a lot, just like making it the absolute best document you've ever made in your life and the best showcase of who you are and why you can provide value. And even if you can't provide a lot of value now, why it's valuable to them to help teach you and why that means long term maybe you'll be able to provide some value to them. And then the third is like practicing for the interviews. Like if you do those three things, like you can usually find something. And I think it also is a little bit of a numbers game where like if you apply to one internship, one place, the odds of getting that one job, if say 100 people apply to it, is like 1%. But if you apply to 100, your odds are much better, right? So some of it is also sort of playing the numbers game and not getting like over fixated on certain programs and just like applying to a bunch of them and seeing what happens, and also not sort of like rejecting yourself. So a lot of times it's easy to look at the requirements they have and seeing like, oh, I don't meet this one requirement. I don't know this one thing they say I need to know. Just like apply anyways. If they reject you, they reject you. Oh, well, you move on. but if you don't apply, it's like you got rejected anyways. So worst case scenario, it's the exact same. Best case scenario, you end up with a job or internship or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I love that advice. Don't be the one that rejects yourself. Like that's so important to remember. So, any last thoughts, Connor, before we go? This has been wonderful. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks. No, I think this has been good. Been fun. Thanks
Well,
for
thank
having
you
me.
so much. And hopefully we can talk soon.
Yeah, for sure.